The dust kicked up in swirling clouds as the Black Hawk helicopter touched down on the makeshift landing zone outside the field hospital. Sarah Martinez stepped off the aircraft, her medical bag clutched tightly in her left hand while her right instinctively checked the sidearm holstered at her hip. The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the compound, and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with the acrid smoke from distant explosions filled her nostrils. She was 28 years old, a Navy nurse with 5 years of experience, but this was her first deployment to a forward operating base. The transition from the sterile corridors of Naval Medical Center Portsmouth to this war-torn landscape felt surreal. Her crisp, digital camouflage uniform was already beginning to show the first signs of the dust that seemed to coat everything in this forsaken place. Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, the base medical officer, approached her with measured steps. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen too much in too little time. Behind him trailed a group of Navy SEALs, their tactical gear heavy with ammunition and their expressions guarded. Sarah noticed how their eyes swept constantly across the perimeter, never truly at rest. "Welcome to FOB Sentinel, Petty Officer Martinez," Harrison said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but brief. "I hope you're ready for what we've got here. This isn't your typical medical facility." Sarah nodded, shouldering her pack. "I've read the briefings, sir. High casualty environment, limited resources, hostile territory on 3 sides. One of the SEALs, a tall man with a thick beard and lieutenant's insignia, stepped forward. "With respect, sir," he said, addressing Harrison while his gaze remained fixed on Sarah. "We requested additional combat medics, not another nurse. No offense to the petty officer, but we need people who can handle themselves in a firefight, not someone who's going to freeze up when the rounds start flying." Sarah felt the familiar surge of frustration that had followed her throughout her career. The assumption that because she was a woman, because she was a nurse, she somehow lacked the capability to function under pressure. She had fought this perception from her first day in the Navy, when drill instructors assumed she would quit before completing basic training. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Harrison said with a slight edge to his voice, "Petty Officer Martinez comes highly recommended. She completed the same field medical training as your combat medics. Plus, she has advanced trauma certification. I think you'll find she's more than capable." Rodriguez's expression remained skeptical. "We'll see about that. Out here, capability means staying alive and keeping others alive when everything goes to hell. This isn't a hospital where you can call for backup." Sarah stepped forward, her posture straight, and her voice steady. "Lieutenant, I didn't volunteer for this deployment to prove anything to anyone. I came here to do my job, which is saving lives. Whether those lives belong to SEALs, Marines, or local civilians doesn't matter to me. What matters is that when someone needs medical attention, they get the best care possible." The tension in the air was palpable. The other SEALs watched the exchange with interest, some nodding approvingly at their lieutenant's protective stance, others seeming curious about how this new addition to their team would handle herself. Harrison gestured toward a series of reinforced concrete buildings that made up the heart of the base. "Let me show you to your quarters, and then we'll tour the medical facility. You'll be sharing space with Dr. Kim, our trauma surgeon, and Chief Petty Officer Williams, who runs our surgical team." As they walked across the compound, Sarah took in her surroundings with a practiced eye. The base was larger than she had expected, with multiple defensive positions and clear fields of fire in all directions. Concertina wire topped the perimeter walls, and she could see guard towers at regular intervals. The medical facility was positioned near the center of the compound, offering maximum protection, but also quick access from all directions. "The hospital treats everyone," Harrison explained as they approached the main medical building. "Coalition forces, Afghan army, local civilians caught in crossfire, even enemy combatants when they're brought in. Our job is to patch them up and either send them back to duty or evacuate them to Germany." Sarah nodded, understanding the complex ethical and practical challenges that came with such a policy. "What's our typical patient load?" "Varies wildly. Some days we see nothing but minor injuries and routine sick call. Other days, Harrison paused as the distant sound of artillery echoed across the valley. Other days, we can have 20 critical casualties come through those doors in the span of an hour. They entered the medical facility through reinforced double doors. The interior was a stark contrast to the harsh environment outside. Clean, well-lit, and surprisingly well-equipped, it looked more like a trauma center back home than a field hospital. Sarah noted the advanced monitoring equipment, the surgical suites, and the blood bank that would be essential for handling mass casualty events. Dr. Kim, a slight Korean-American woman in her 40s, looked up from a medical chart as they entered. Her scrubs were clean, but Sarah could see the fatigue in her eyes that came from long hours and constant stress. Dr. Kim, this is Petty Officer Martinez, our new nurse, Harrison said. Sarah, Dr. Kim has been here for 8 months. She's probably saved more lives than anyone else on this base. Dr. Kim smiled warmly and shook Sarah's hand. Welcome to our little corner of chaos. I hope you brought your sense of humor, because out here it's either laugh or cry, and crying doesn't help anyone. Chief Petty Officer Williams emerged from one of the supply rooms, his arms full of medical equipment. He was a large man with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades in military medicine. Another nurse? Good. We can use all the help we can get. You ever worked trauma before? 5 years at Portsmouth, Sarah replied. Emergency department and ICU rotations. I've seen my share of gunshot wounds and blast injuries. Williams nodded approvingly. Good. Out here, that's pretty much all we see. That and the occasional case of someone doing something stupid and getting hurt in creative ways. As Harrison continued the tour, showing her the supply areas, the evacuation procedures, and the communication systems, Sarah became aware of the constant background noise that filled the base. The hum of generators, the occasional crack of sniper fire in the distance, the radio chatter from the operations center. It was a symphony of controlled chaos that would become the soundtrack of her deployment. Your quarters are in Building C, Harrison said, leading her to a small but functional room with a cot, a desk, and a small locker. You'll share bathroom facilities with the other female personnel. There aren't many of us out here, so we tend to look out for each other. Sarah set down her bags and looked around the Spartan accommodations. It was hardly luxurious, but she had expected worse. The walls were concrete, providing protection from both the elements and potential mortar attacks. A small window offered a view of the perimeter and the mountains beyond. Meals are served in the main hall at 0600, 1200, and 1800, Harrison continued. Medical staff is on call 24/7, but we try to maintain a rotation so everyone gets some rest. The pharmacy is well stocked, but remember that resupply convoys only come through twice a week, weather and security permitting. As they returned to the medical facility, Sarah noticed Lieutenant Rodriguez and his team preparing for what appeared to be a patrol. Their gear was meticulously organized, every piece of equipment checked and double-checked. She observed the practiced efficiency with which they moved, the subtle hand signals they used to communicate, the way they automatically covered different sectors as they moved through the compound. The SEALs run regular patrols in the surrounding area, Harrison explained, following her gaze. Intelligence gathering, relationship building with local leaders, disrupting enemy activity. They're good at what they do, but they also take a lot of casualties. Improvised explosive devices are the biggest threat, followed by small arms fire and the occasional rocket attack on the base itself. Rodriguez approached them as his team finished their preparations. Doc, we're heading out to check on the village elder in Sector 7. Should be back before nightfall, but if something happens, I'll have everything ready, Dar. Kim called from inside the medical facility. Try to bring them back in one piece this time. Rodriguez turned to Sarah with an expression that seemed to soften slightly. Listen, Petty Officer, I wasn't trying to be a complete ass earlier. It's just that out here, everyone needs to pull their weight. We can't afford to have weak links in the chain. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I understand, Lieutenant. You're responsible for your men, and you want to know that everyone around them is competent. I respect that. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove myself before you write me off. Something flickered in Rodriguez's eyes, perhaps a grudging respect for her directness. Fair enough. We'll see how you handle your first real emergency. Out here, that usually doesn't take long. As the SEAL team departed through the main gate, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension settle in her stomach. She had trained for this, prepared mentally and physically for the challenges of battlefield medicine, but training could only take someone so far. The real test would come when lives hung in the balance, and there was no room for hesitation or error. Dr. Kim appeared beside her, watching the SEALs disappear into the dusty landscape beyond the wire. Rodriguez is actually a good guy, she said quietly. He's lost too many people, seen too many friends come back in pieces. The skepticism isn't personal, it's survival. Out here, trust has to be earned. I can understand that, Sarah replied. I've dealt with skeptical colleagues before. Usually, the best way to win them over is just to do the job better than they expected. Well, you'll get your chance soon enough. This place has a way of testing everyone who comes through those doors. The question isn't whether you'll face a crisis, it's how you'll handle it when you do. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah familiarized herself with the medical protocols, the inventory systems, and the evacuation procedures. She learned which radio frequencies to monitor, how to coordinate with the helicopter landing zone, and the specific challenges of treating patients in a combat environment where the enemy was always just outside the wire. Chief Williams took her through the pharmacy, explaining the limited supplies and the need to sometimes make difficult decisions about resource allocation. We've got good trauma drugs, plenty of blood products, and surgical supplies, he said. What we don't have is unlimited quantities of anything. Sometimes you have to choose between giving one patient the optimal dose and making sure you have enough left for the next casualty. The weight of such decisions settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. In civilian hospitals, resource management was important, but rarely life or death. Here, every decision carried the potential for irreversible consequences. As evening approached, and the temperature began to drop, Sarah joined the rest of the medical staff for dinner in the main hall. The conversation was casual, but carried an undercurrent of tension that never quite disappeared. Everyone was constantly aware that at any moment, the relative calm could be shattered by incoming casualties or enemy fire. Dr. Kim shared stories of particularly challenging cases, not with morbid fascination, but with the clinical detachment necessary to learn from each experience. The worst part isn't the traumatic injuries, she explained. It's the ones that look routine, but turn out to have complications you didn't anticipate. A simple gunshot wound to the leg that nicks an artery you couldn't see. A concussion that turns into intracranial bleeding 6 hours later. After dinner, Sarah made her way back to her quarters, the sounds of the base settling into its nighttime routine around her. Guard duty rotations changed, radio traffic shifted to overnight frequencies, and the defensive posture subtly adjusted for the different threats that came with darkness. She sat on her cot, writing in the journal she had promised to keep for her sister back home. How could she possibly convey the complexity of this place, the constant balance between normalcy and chaos, the way everyone carried themselves with the knowledge that death was always just one mistake away? Outside her window, she could see the silhouettes of the guard towers against the star-filled sky. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, Lieutenant Rodriguez and his team were making their way back from their patrol, navigating routes that had been cleared earlier, but could harbor new threats at any moment. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah reflected on her first day at FOB Sentinel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patience, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust that Liv's depended upon. She had wanted to serve in a place where her skills could make a real difference, where the work mattered in the most fundamental way possible. Now, surrounded by the sounds of a military base at war, she was beginning to understand that she had gotten exactly what she had asked for. The question that remained was whether she was truly ready for everything that came with it. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence like a physical blow. Sarah jolted awake, her body instantly alert despite having been deep in sleep moments before. The klaxon's urgent wail meant incoming casualties, and she could already hear the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air. She was dressed and running toward the medical facility within 90 seconds, her boots pounding against the packed earth as other personnel emerged from buildings across the compound. The routine they had drilled countless times took over, muscle memory guiding her through the checklist of preparations that could mean the difference between life and death. DR. Kim was already in the trauma bay, pulling on surgical gloves as Chief Williams wheeled in additional supplies. Multiple casualties inbound, Kim called out without looking up. Rodriguez's team hit an IED on their return route. We've got at least 4 wounded, status unknown. Sarah felt her stomach clench, but her hands remained steady as she began setting up 4 stations and checking the blood bank supplies. This was what she had trained for, what she had come here to do. The fact that she knew the patients personally would make it harder, but it couldn't change how she approached the job. The helicopter's approach grew louder, and through the reinforced windows, Sarah could see dust clouds rising from the landing zone. Lieutenant Commander Harrison burst through the doors, his radio crackling with updates from the flight medic. First casualty is critical. Blast injury with multiple shrapnel wounds and possible internal bleeding, he announced. Second has a compound fracture of the left tibia and severe burns. Third and fourth are ambulatory but need immediate attention for head injuries and glass fragments. The doors flew open as the first stretcher arrived. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the patient. It was Rodriguez himself, unconscious and covered in blood, his tactical gear cut away to reveal the extent of his injuries. The flight medic rattled off vitals and treatment administered en route as they transferred him to the trauma bed. Pulse 120 and thready, blood pressure dropping, multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, the medic reported. We've got 2 IVs running, and he's received 4 units of blood during transport. Dr. Kim was already examining the wounds, her experienced hands probing gently but efficiently. I need to type and cross-match stat. Sarah, give me another large bore 4 and push blood products. We're going to surgery in 5 minutes. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, her training taking over as she pushed aside any personal feelings about the patient. Rodriguez was no longer the skeptical SEAL who had questioned her competence. He was a trauma victim who needed immediate medical intervention to survive. The second stretcher brought in Petty Officer Jackson, Rodriguez's team's communications specialist. The compound fracture was obvious, bone protruding through the skin of his lower leg, but Sarah was more concerned about the burns covering his arms and torso. The acrid smell of burned flesh and fabric filled the room as they began cutting away his gear. Burns are second and third degree, covering approximately 20% of his body, Chief Williams observed grimly. We need to get him cooled down and establish pain control. This is going to be a long surgery. While Dr. Kim worked on Rodriguez, Sarah found herself taking the lead on Jackson's case. The responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was exactly the kind of complex trauma case she had trained for, but the stakes felt impossibly high. Jackson, can you hear me? She asked as she began assessing his injuries more thoroughly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but responsive. Where's the LT? He mumbled through gritted teeth. Is Rodriguez okay? He's being taken care of, Sarah replied honestly. Right now, I need you to focus on staying with me. We're going to get you cleaned up and take care of that leg. The third and fourth casualties were brought in as Sarah worked on Jackson's 4-axis. Petty Officer Chun had a concussion and multiple lacerations from flying glass, while Petty Officer Santos had taken shrapnel to his shoulder and arm. Both were conscious and talking, which was encouraging, but head injuries could be deceptive. Chun, I need you to tell me your name, the date, and where you are, Sarah called out as she continued working on Jackson's burns. Michael Chun, it's Tuesday. We're at FOB Sentinel. Chun replied slowly, his words slightly slurred. Close enough, Sarah said. Any nausea, vision problems, or confusion besides what I'd expect from getting your bell rung? The next several hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Dr. Kim and Chief Williams worked on Rodriguez in the surgical suite, while Sarah managed the other 3 patients with assistance from the base's other medical personnel. The compound fracture required immediate surgical intervention to clean the wound and stabilize the bone, while the burns needed constant monitoring and pain management. As she worked, Sarah became aware that word of the casualties had spread throughout the base. Other members of Rodriguez's SEAL team gathered outside the medical facility, their faces grim as they waited for updates. The tight-knit nature of the special operations community meant that every injury was felt personally by the entire unit. Master Chief Petty Officer Harrison, the senior enlisted SEAL on the base, approached Sarah as she finished applying fresh dressings to Jackson's burns. Harrison was a legendary figure even among the elite SEAL community, a man who had served in every major conflict of the past 2 decades and whose mere presence seemed to calm the most volatile situations. "How are my boys, Petty Officer?" he asked quietly. His voice carried the weight of someone who had asked that question too many times before. Sarah looked up from her work, meeting his gaze directly. "Jackson and Santos are stable. The burns are painful, but manageable, and we've got the fracture stabilized until we can get him to surgery. Chun has a concussion, but his neurological signs are improving. Rodriguez." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's in surgery now. Dr. Kim is one of the best trauma surgeons I've ever worked with. If anyone can pull him through, it's her." Harrison nodded slowly. "Rodriguez spoke about you yesterday after they got back from patrol. Said he might have misjudged you. Guess we'll find out for sure." The comment hung in the air as Harrison moved on to speak with his other wounded teammates. Sarah realized that this was more than just a medical emergency. It was her first real test in the eyes of the SEAL community. How she performed over the next several hours would determine whether she was accepted as a trusted member of the team or remain an outsider. Dr. Kim emerged from surgery 3 hours later, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She pulled off her surgical cap and gloves before updating the waiting SEALs and medical staff. "Rodriguez is stable," she announced, and Sarah could see the tension leave the shoulders of every SEAL in the room. "We removed 18 pieces of shrapnel, repaired damage to his spleen and liver, and stopped internal bleeding. He's going to need several more surgeries, but he should make a full recovery." The relief in the room was palpable, but Dr. Kim wasn't finished. However, he's going to need constant monitoring for the next 48 hours. Any sign of internal bleeding, infection, or complications, and we'll need to get him evacuated to Germany immediately. Sarah stepped forward. "I could take the first shift, doctor. I've got experience with post-operative monitoring, and I'm fresh." "Doctor, Kim nodded gratefully. "Good. Chief Williams will spell you in 12 hours. Watch his vitals, check his drainage tubes every hour, and call me immediately if anything changes." As the immediate crisis passed and the other patients were stabilized, Sarah found herself alone with Rodriguez in the intensive care area. He was unconscious, connected to multiple monitors and for lines, but his vital signs were steady and strong. She settled into the chair beside his bed, beginning the methodical process of monitoring and documentation that would continue throughout the night. Every hour, she checked his drainage tubes, recorded his vital signs, and assessed his neurological status. It was tedious work, but she knew that the smallest change could signal a life-threatening complication. Around midnight, Rodriguez began to stir. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, but gradually becoming more alert as the anesthesia wore off. "Where am I?" he asked hoarsely. "FOB Sentinel Medical Facility," Sarah replied, leaning forward so he could see her clearly. You hit an IED on patrol yesterday. You're going to be okay, but you need a rest. Rodriguez tried to sit up, but winced as pain shot through his abdomen. My team, Jackson, Sheng, Santos, all alive, all being taken care of, Sarah assured him. Jackson has some burns and a broken leg, but he's stable. Chen has a concussion. Santos took some shrapnel. They're all going to recover. Relief flooded Rodriguez's features, and he settled back against his pillow. For several minutes they sat in silence. The only sounds the steady beeping of monitors and the distant hum of the base's generators. I owe you an apology, Rodriguez said finally. What I said when you arrived, it was out of line. Sarah shook her head. You were looking out for your team. I understand that. Out here, trust has to be earned. Yeah. Well, you've earned it, Rodriguez replied. Jackson told me how you handled his case. Said you knew exactly what you were doing, kept him calm while you worked. That means something. I was just doing my job, Sarah said simply. No, Rodriguez corrected her. A lot of people can do the technical parts of the job. Fewer can do it under pressure, in an environment like this, when everything's going wrong at once. Even fewer can do it while making the patient feel like they're in good hands. As the night progressed, other members of Rodriguez's team stopped by to check on their lieutenant. Each conversation was brief, but revealing. Sarah could see the bonds that held these men together, the loyalty that went beyond simple military duty. She began to understand why Rodriguez had been so protective of his team and so skeptical of outsiders. Around 0300, Rodriguez developed a low-grade fever. Sarah immediately called Dr. Kim, who arrived within minutes to assess the situation. After a thorough examination and review of his lab work, she determined it was likely a normal post-operative response rather than infection, but they increased his antibiotic coverage as a precaution. Good catch, Dr. Kim said quietly as they stood outside his room. A lot of people might have waited until morning to call me. Out here, waiting can kill people. As dawn approached and Chief Williams arrived to take over the monitoring duties, Sarah reflected on her first major medical crisis at FOB Sentinel. She had handled complex trauma cases before, but never in an environment where the patients were people she knew, where the stakes felt so personal. Rodriguez was awake when she stopped by his bed to say goodbye. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Sarah nodded. Get some rest. You've got a long recovery ahead of you. As she walked back to her quarters for a few hours of sleep before the day shift began, Sarah felt something had changed. The skeptical looks from the other SEALs had been replaced by nods of acknowledgement. She had proven herself under pressure, shown that she could function effectively when everything was falling apart. But more than that, she had begun to understand what Dr. Kim had meant about this place testing everyone who came through its doors. FOB Sentinel wasn't just a military base or a medical facility. It was a crucible where people discovered what they were truly capable of when everything they had trained for was put to the ultimate test. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost peaceful despite the violence that surrounded them. Sarah knew that yesterday's casualties were just the beginning. There would be more emergencies, more tests, more opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust that lives depended upon. She was ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks had passed since the IED incident, and the dynamics at FOB Sentinel had shifted considerably. Rodriguez was back on limited duty, his injuries healing faster than expected, and the SEAL teams had begun including Sarah in their informal briefings about upcoming operations. She was no longer the outsider trying to prove herself. She had become an integral part of the base's operational capability. The morning started like any other, with Sarah conducting sick call for minor injuries and routine medical issues. The heat was already building despite the early hour, and she could see heat waves shimmering off the helicopter landing pad through the medical facility's windows. Chief Williams was updating inventory reports while Dr. Kim reviewed cases for potential medical evacuation to Germany. The relative calm was shattered when the base's communications center erupted with urgent radio traffic. Sarah looked up from the antibiotics she was administering to a Marine with an infected cut to see Lieutenant Commander Harrison rushing into the medical facility, his face grave. "We have a situation," he announced. "The village school in Sector 5 is under attack. Estimated 40 to 50 hostile fighters have taken control of the building and are holding approximately 60 children and teachers hostage." Dr. Kim set down her paperwork immediately. "Casualties? Unknown at this time, but we have to assume there will be. The school has been converted into a temporary medical clinic for the local population. There are already injured civilians inside when the attack began." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had heard about the school during her briefings. It served as both an educational facility and a community health center supported by coalition forces as part of the Hearts and Minds campaign. The thought of children caught in the middle of a firefight made her stomach clench with anxiety. Master Chief Harrison entered the facility with Rodriguez close behind. Despite still wearing a support brace for his healing injuries, the SEAL lieutenant looked ready for action. "What's the plan?" Dr. Kim asked. "Rescue operation launches in 30 minutes. Master Chief Harrison replied. "2 SEAL teams will assault the building while a third provides perimeter security. The problem is that intelligence suggests the hostiles have positioned themselves throughout the school, including in the improvised medical ward." Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression serious. "The medical ward is on the 2nd floor of the main building. According to our sources, there are at least 15 wounded civilians in that area, along with a local nurse who was providing care when the attack began. 15 people who can't move quickly or defend themselves," Sarah said, understanding the implications immediately. "They'll be caught in the crossfire when the assault begins." "Exactly," Master Chief Harrison confirmed. "Which is why we need a medic inside before the shooting starts. Someone who can assess the wounded, provide emergency care, and help coordinate their evacuation when we secure the building." Dr. Kim shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. I'm not sending any of my people into an active hostage situation. It's too dangerous." "With respect," Dr. Rodriguez interjected, "those civilians are going to die if they don't get medical attention during the assault. Some of them are already in critical condition. We need someone with advanced trauma training in that room." Sarah found herself speaking before she had fully processed the implications. "I'll go." The room fell silent. Dr. Kim stared at her in shock while the 2 SEALs exchanged glances. "Sarah, no," Dr. Kim said firmly. "You're a nurse, not a commando. This is exactly the kind of situation where good people get killed trying to be heroes." "I'm not trying to be a hero," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But Rodriguez is right. Those people need immediate medical care, and I'm the only one here with the training and experience to provide it under combat conditions." Master Chief Harrison studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions. "Petty officer, I need you to understand what you're volunteering for. This isn't a medical emergency in a secure facility. You'll be inserting into a building held by hostiles who have already demonstrated they're willing to kill civilians. If the assault goes wrong, if we can't reach you in time." "I understand the risks," Sarah said. "But I also understand that 15 people will die if someone doesn't help them. That's not acceptable." Rodriguez limped closer, his expression intense. "If you do this, you'll be operating alone in hostile territory for at least 20 minutes before we can reach you. You'll need to be able to defend yourself and your patients if the situation deteriorates." Sarah nodded. "I can handle a weapon. I qualified expert marksman in basic training, and I've kept up my proficiency scores." "Qualifying on a range is different from shooting at people who are shooting back at you," Rodriguez said bluntly. "Are you prepared for that reality?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah had never fired a weapon in anger, never been in a situation where she might have to take a life to save others. The theoretical knowledge of combat medicine was vastly different from the reality of providing care while under direct fire. "Yes," she said simply. "If it means protecting my patients, I'm prepared for that." Dr. Kim made one final attempt to dissuade her. "Sarah, you're one of the best nurses I've ever worked with, but this is insane. We can provide care after the assault is complete." "After might be too late," Sarah replied. Some of those people are probably bleeding out right now. Every minute we wait increases the chance that they'll die from wounds that could be treated. Master Chief Harrison exchanged a long look with Rodriguez before nodding slowly. All right, Petty Officer, if you're committed to this, we'll make it work. But you follow our rules, our procedures, and our timeline. No heroics, no deviation from the plan. The next 25 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah was fitted with body armor and communications equipment, while Rodriguez briefed her on the building layout and insertion plan. She would be dropped on the roof by helicopter and make her way to the medical ward through an internal stairwell while the SEAL teams prepared for their assault. Your call sign is Angel 1, Rodriguez explained as she checked her medical supplies. You'll have direct communication with the assault teams and the command post. If the situation becomes untenable, if you're in immediate danger, you call for extraction immediately. Sarah nodded, focusing on the tactical details to avoid dwelling on the enormity of what she was about to attempt. The medical pack she carried contained trauma supplies optimized for treating gunshot wounds and blast injuries, everything she would need to stabilize critical patients until they could be evacuated. Remember, Master Chief Harrison added, your primary mission is medical care. Don't try to be a warrior unless you have no other choice. But if that choice comes, don't hesitate. Hesitation gets people killed. The helicopter insertion went smoothly. Sarah rappelled onto the school's roof without incident, her heart pounding as she made her way to the access door. The building below was eerily quiet. No gunfire, no shouting, just the occasional muffled sound that could have been conversation or crying. She made her way down the darkened stairwell, her weapon ready, but her focus on the medical mission ahead. The second-floor hallway was dimly lit, and she could smell the unmistakable scent of blood and antiseptic that indicated recent medical procedures. The door to the medical ward was partially open. Sarah peered through the gap and felt her heart sink at what she saw inside. 15 people lay on makeshift stretchers and bedrolls, their injuries ranging from minor lacerations to what appeared to be life-threatening trauma. A young Afghan woman in blood-stained scrubs knelt beside one of the patients, applying pressure to a chest wound. Sarah keyed her radio. Angel 1 in position. Multiple casualties confirmed, at least 3 critical. Beginning medical assessment now. She slipped into the room and approached the Afghan nurse, who looked up with a mixture of relief and terror. American doctor? The woman asked in broken English. American nurse, Sarah corrected quietly. What's the situation here? The local nurse, who introduced herself as Fatima, quickly briefed Sarah on the patient's conditions. 3 had suffered gunshot wounds during the initial attack, 4 had blast injuries from grenades thrown into the building, and the rest had various trauma injuries from falling debris and stampeding crowds. Sarah immediately triaged the patients, identifying those who needed immediate intervention to survive. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was showing signs of internal bleeding. An elderly man had a sucking chest wound that had partially collapsed his lung. A teenage girl was unconscious with what appeared to be a serious head injury. Working quickly but methodically, Sarah began providing emergency care. She established 4 access for the boy and began fluid resuscitation while Fatima assisted with supplies and translation. The chest wound required an immediate chest tube insertion, a procedure Sarah had performed dozens of times in control hospital settings, but never under these circumstances. Angel 1, be advised we have movement in the building. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece. At least 20 hostiles confirmed on the first floor. Assault commences in 15 minutes. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while continuing to work on the chest tube insertion. The elderly man grimaced as she made the incision, but his breathing immediately improved as trapped air escaped from his chest cavity. As she moved to assess the head injury patient, Sarah became aware of voices in the hallway outside the medical ward. Male voices, speaking in Pashto, growing closer. She signaled for Fatima to continue caring for the chest wound patient while she moved toward the door, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. Through the partially open door, she could see 3 armed men approaching down the hallway. They wore a mixture of military gear and civilian clothing, their faces covered with scarves. Each carried an assault rifle, and Sarah could see hand grenades clipped to their tactical vests. Her heart rate spiked, but her training took over. She had approximately 30 seconds before they reached the medical ward. The room had only one entrance, and there was no way to move the patients quickly enough to avoid discovery. Sarah made a decision that would change everything that followed. Instead of hiding or trying to barricade the door, she stepped into the hallway and addressed the approaching fighters in the few words of Pashto she had learned. "Stop, doctor. Patients inside," she said, using the universal hand gesture for medical care. The 3 men stopped, clearly surprised to encounter an American nurse in the hallway. They began talking rapidly among themselves, and Sarah could see the confusion in their body language. She was obviously not a combatant. Her gear was clearly medical rather than tactical, but she was also clearly American military. One of the fighters, apparently the leader, stepped forward and spoke in accented English. "You are American soldier?" "I am American nurse," Sarah replied, keeping her voice calm and steady. "There are wounded people inside. Civilians. Children. They need medical help." The fighter's expression was unreadable behind his face covering, but Sarah could see his eyes. There was intelligence there, and what she hoped was some measure of human compassion. "You leave now," he said. "No Americans in building." "I cannot leave," Sarah replied. "There is a little boy inside who will die without treatment. There is an old man who cannot breathe. I am a doctor. It is my duty to help them." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could smell the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke that clung to the fighter's clothing. Behind her, she could hear Fatima continuing to provide care to the patients, could hear the labored breathing of the elderly man with the chest wound. The leader gestured to one of his companions, who peered into the medical ward. Sarah heard him reporting what he saw: clearly wounded civilians, clearly a medical operation in progress. "You have weapons," the leader observed, noting the pistol at Sarah's hip. "For protection only," Sarah replied. "I am here to save lives, not take them." The radio crackled in her earpiece, but she couldn't risk responding. The SEAL teams were probably wondering why she hadn't provided a status update, but any communication now could shatter the fragile equilibrium of the situation. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 2 minutes, the leader made his decision. He barked orders to his companions in Pashto, then turned back to Sarah. "You stay with wounded. No radio. No weapons. You help people only." Sarah nodded, understanding that she had just negotiated a temporary ceasefire in a room full of casualties. It was an impossible situation. She was essentially agreeing to become a prisoner in order to continue providing medical care, with no way to communicate with the rescue forces that were preparing to assault the building. But as she looked back at the patients in the medical ward, at Fatima, who was desperately trying to stop bleeding with inadequate supplies, at the little boy whose life hung by the thinnest of threads, Sarah knew she had made the only choice she could live with. The 3 fighters positioned themselves at strategic points around the medical ward, close enough to monitor her activities, but far enough away to avoid interfering with medical procedures. Sarah returned to her patients, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to complete her mission while trapped between 2 opposing forces. She had volunteered to save lives. Now she had to find a way to do exactly that while caught in the middle of a battle that was about to begin whether she was ready or not. Sarah worked in tense silence, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she continued treating the wounded civilians while 3 armed fighters watched her every movement. The little boy with abdominal injuries was stabilizing, his vital signs improving after the 4 fluids and pain medication she had administered. The elderly man's breathing was easier following the chest tube insertion, though he remained weak from blood loss. The radio in her earpiece remained ominously quiet. The assault should have begun by now, but The SEAL teams were probably reassessing their approach after losing communication with her. She could only imagine the difficult decisions being made in the command post: proceed with the assault and risk her life, or delay and potentially lose the hostages to whatever the fighters had planned. Fatima continued to assist, her eyes darting nervously between Sarah and the armed men who had positioned themselves around the room. The local nurse was clearly terrified, but refusing to abandon her patients, a courage that Sarah found both inspiring and heartbreaking. The fighter, who appeared to be the leader, spoke quietly into his own radio, receiving updates from other positions in the building. Sarah caught enough fragments to understand that they were discussing the American forces gathering outside, debating whether to begin executing hostages or attempt to negotiate. As Sarah moved to check on the teenage girl with the head injury, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The girl's pupils were becoming unequal in size, a classic sign of increasing intracranial pressure that could be fatal without immediate surgical intervention. There was no way to perform the necessary procedure in this makeshift medical ward, and certainly not under these circumstances. She looked up at the leader, her expression grave. "This girl will die without surgery. I need to take her to the hospital." The fighter shook his head firmly. "No one leaves. American soldiers will shoot. Then she dies," Sarah said simply. "Is that what you want? A 16-year-old girl who is only trying to help wounded people." For a moment, something flickered in the man's eyes. Sarah realized that whatever ideology had brought him here, he was still human, still capable of recognizing unnecessary suffering. But before he could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the floor below. The assault had begun. The three fighters immediately moved to defensive positions, their attention split between watching Sarah and monitoring the sounds of combat filtering up from the lower levels. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of assault rifles mixed with the heavier reports of the SEALs' weapons. Somewhere in the building, men were fighting and dying. "Get down!" Sarah shouted to Fatima as bullets began hitting the walls around them. She threw herself over the little boy with abdominal injuries, using her own body to shield him from flying debris as plaster and concrete chips rained down from above. The leader barked orders to his companions, who moved to cover the doorway. Sarah realized with growing horror that the medical ward was about to become a battleground, with 15 wounded civilians caught in the crossfire. "You cannot fight in here," she called out to the leader. "These people are already hurt. Move your fight somewhere else." But the tactical situation had overtaken any concern for the wounded. The fighters could hear American forces moving through the building below, systematically clearing rooms and eliminating resistance. This upper floor represented their last defensive position, and they clearly intended to make their stand here. The radio crackled in Sarah's earpiece as someone finally managed to reach her frequency. "Angel 1, this is Reaper 6. What's your status?" Sarah glanced at the fighters, who were focused on the approaching sounds of combat. She keyed her microphone briefly. "Angel 1 has 15 casualties in medical ward, second floor, east wing. 3 hostiles in defensive positions. Civilians cannot be moved." "Copy, Angel 1. Reaper team is 2 minutes out from your position." 2 minutes. Sarah looked around the room at her patients, at Fatima, who was still trying to provide care despite the chaos erupting around them, at the teenage girl whose brain injury was worsening by the minute. 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours. The sound of boots thundering up the stairwell grew louder. The 3 fighters took final positions, their weapons trained on the doorway where the American assault team would appear. Sarah realized that when the shooting started, everyone in this room would be at risk. She made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. Sarah stood up, placing herself between the fighters and the doorway. "Stop," she said firmly, addressing the leader. "Look around you. Look at what you're protecting." The fighter's eyes flicked to her, confusion replacing his combat focus for a moment. "That boy," Sarah continued, pointing to her 8-year-old patient, "he's not American. He's not your enemy. He's a child who was hurt when your people attacked this building. That old man over there, he's probably someone's grandfather. The girl with the head injury, she was volunteering here as a nurse, just like me. The leader's weapon wavered slightly, but his finger remained on the trigger. You want to fight Americans? I understand that, Sarah said. But not here. Not with wounded civilians in the room. Take me as a hostage if you need leverage. Leave the wounded out of this. Sada, no. Fatima whispered from where she crouched beside one of the patients. The boots in the stairwell were getting closer. Sarah could hear Rodriguez's voice coordinating with his team, could hear the methodical progress of professionally trained soldiers clearing their way toward the medical ward. The leader stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing his options. Use the wounded as human shields and guarantee that civilians would die in the crossfire, or find another way to continue the fight. You are a brave woman, he said finally. But stupid. Maybe, Sarah agreed. But I'm not moving. The first SEAL appeared in the doorway, his weapon raised and ready to fire. Sarah recognized Rodriguez despite his tactical gear, could see the shock in his eyes as he took in the scene. An American nurse standing between armed fighters and a room full of wounded civilians. Hold fire, Sarah called out immediately. Wounded in the room. Civilians. The tactical situation was unlike anything in the SEAL playbook. Normally, they would have thrown flashbang grenades and stormed the room, overwhelming the defenders through shock and superior firepower. But with Sarah and the wounded civilians in the line of fire, such tactics would cause exactly the casualties they were trying to prevent. The standoff stretched for seconds that felt like hours. Rodriguez and his team maintained their positions in the hallway while the three fighters kept their weapons trained on the doorway. Sarah stood in the middle, acutely aware that she was probably going to die in the next few moments, but determined that her patients would survive. Then, the leader did something unexpected. He slowly lowered his weapon and spoke in English loud enough for everyone to hear. American nurse speaks truth. Wounded people are not soldiers. We will not hide behind injured children. He barked orders to his companions in Pashto. After a moment of confusion, they also lowered their weapons. Sarah felt a surge of hope, but she knew the situation was still incredibly volatile. Rodriguez stepped partially into the room, his weapon still ready but not directly aimed at the fighters. What are you proposing? He asked the leader. We surrender to you. But nurse continues to help wounded. No shooting in this room. Sarah could hear Rodriguez's radio crackling with updates from the command post, could imagine the heated discussions taking place as commanders tried to process this unprecedented situation. A combat surrender in the middle of a hostage rescue operation, negotiated by a Navy nurse who had no authorization to conduct such negotiations. Rodriguez, Sarah said quietly, the girl with the head injury needs immediate surgery or she's going to die. The boy with the abdominal wound needs surgical exploration. I've done what I can here, but they need a real operating room. Rodriguez nodded slowly, understanding the medical urgency even as he processed the tactical implications. Angel 1, can you stabilize these patients for evacuation? Already done for transport, Sarah replied. But we need to move fast. What followed was perhaps the most surreal scene in the history of special operations warfare. The three Afghan fighters, under heavy guard but not restrained, actually assisted in moving the wounded civilians to the helicopter landing zone. The leader helped carry the stretcher bearing the little boy Sarah had treated, while his companions provided support for the elderly man with the chest wound. The teenage girl with the head injury was evacuated on the first helicopter, accompanied by Dr. Kim, who had flown in specifically to provide surgical support during transport. Sarah watched the aircraft disappear into the distance, knowing that the girl's survival now depended on the neurosurgical team in Germany. As the remaining patients were loaded on as subsequent flights, Master Chief Harrison approached Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Petty Officer Martinez, he said formally, you understand that you just negotiated a surrender without authorization, placed yourself in extreme danger, and completely improvised outside the mission parameters. Sarah straightened, expecting formal reprimand or worse. Yes, Master Chief. I understand. You also saved the lives of 15 civilians who would have been caught in a firefight, prevented what could have been a bloodbath, and demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and judgment that makes the difference between good and great military personnel. Sarah blinked in surprise. Master Chief, the official report will note that you conducted medical operations under extreme conditions and contributed to the successful rescue of civilian hostages, Harrison continued. The unofficial report will note that you've got bigger balls than half the SEALs I've served with. Rodriguez limped over as the last helicopter prepared for departure. Despite his healing injuries, he had insisted on leading the assault team, and Sarah could see the exhaustion and relief in his face. "So," he said with a slight smile, "still think you're just doing your job?" Sarah looked around at the aftermath of the operation. The empty school building, the bloodstains on the medical ward floor, the Afghan fighters now in custody, but treated with dignity rather than as defeated enemies. 15 people were alive who might have been dead if she had made different choices. "Yes," she said simply. "This is exactly the job I signed up for." 2 months later, Sarah received word that all 15 patients had survived their injuries. The little boy had made a full recovery after surgery in Germany. The elderly man had returned to his village with no lasting effects from his chest wound. The teenage girl had required 2 additional surgeries for her head injury, but was expected to recover completely. The 3 Afghan fighters had been transferred to a detention facility where they were being processed according to the rules of war. Intelligence reports indicated that their cooperation during the medical evacuation had been noted by other insurgent groups in the region, leading to several instances where wounded civilians were allowed to receive medical care rather than being used as human shields. Dr. Kim had nominated Sarah for a Bronze Star with Combat Distinguishing Device for her actions during the rescue operation. The citation read, in part, Petty Officer Martinez's exceptional courage under fire, innovative problem-solving under extreme pressure, and unwavering commitment to preserving human life exemplify the highest traditions of naval service. But the recognition Sarah valued most came from an unexpected source. A week after the rescue operation, she found a letter waiting for her in the base mail system. It was written in broken English on notebook paper and signed simply Fatima. American Nurse Sarah, the letter read. Thank you for staying with wounded people. Thank you for protecting children. You show me that being brave is not about having no fear. Being brave is about doing right thing when you are afraid. I will remember this always. You're a good person. You're a good nurse. Thank you for showing me what this means. Sarah read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in her personal journal. Outside her window, she could see the helicopter landing zone where new casualties were arriving from another patrol that had encountered an IED. Dr. Kim was already moving toward the medical facility, and Sarah could hear Chief Williams preparing the trauma bay. She stood up, checked her equipment, and headed toward what would undoubtedly be another test of everything she had learned about practicing medicine in a combat zone. As she walked across the compound, Sarah realized that FOB Sentinel had indeed become exactly what she had called it during her confrontation with the insurgent leader. This was her home. This was where she belonged. This was the place where her training, her courage, and her commitment to preserving life could make the greatest possible difference. The work continued, and Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever came next.